Okay, so the brain is the next thing that we're going to talk about. Maybe. So humans absolutely 100% use more than 10% of their brains. It is not the case. Our bodies are way too efficient for us to only use 10% of our brains. About 60% of students last semester thought that at the beginning of term. It is not true. I'm sure that myth comes from movies and just myth type things, but it is not true. If you look at brain scans, almost 100% of our brain is used at all times. If there is a period of time that you don't use a certain part or certain connections of your brain, those connections die and they're replaced because the brain just doesn't keep connections or portions of itself that don't work. Okay, so parts of the brain, developmentally speaking, so in utero, we have three main parts of our brain: the forebrain, the midbrain, and the hindbrain. These distinctions aren't incredibly important for you to know, but that's just developmentally how it happens. It's also true that the hindbrain and the midbrain are older, evolutionarily speaking. The forebrain, the wrinkly part on the top that really covers everything, is not as recent evolutionarily, and it is part that sets humans apart from other animals. So here are some of the parts of the brain. I would just challenge you to have a very small understanding of each of the parts of the brain. You don't need to memorize all, very specific details about it, but just have a general idea. So think a sentence definition for each of them. It's important to know that the corpus callosum is what connects the two hemispheres of the brain. So your cerebellum, or the gray wrinkly part, which is what you guys think about when you think about a brain usually, is what connects the two hemispheres. So our cerebrum, or our cortex, cerebral cortex, is separated into two hemispheres, and we'll talk about that in a minute. But the corpus callosum is what connects those two halves. Okay. So the limbic system is the next system I want to talk about. There is some debate about what is included in the limbic system, but for us, the hypothalamus, the amygdala, and the hippocampus are all structures of the brain that are included in the limbic system. The limbic system helps us deal with emotion, usually those basic human emotions like fear, anger, sadness, those sort of emotions. Your amygdala is the structure in your brain that deals with or is activated when those emotions are happening. Your hippocampus is what processes memory, and so when you remember things that are particularly emotional, you can see how the amygdala is right there next to, almost connected to the hippocampus. The cerebrum and the cerebral cortex, same thing, different name. We do not get new brain wrinkles when we learn new things. 36% of people last semester thought that. That's not true. We have brain wrinkles in order to increase the surface area of our brain. So for those of you who don't know, the brain has a much larger surface area because of those wrinkles. The best way I can demonstrate that is by showing you how, if you were to say, have a piece of paper, like a lined notebook paper like this, we know that this would not fit into my pocket right now, mostly because I have on stupid pants made for women and I have small little stupid chick pockets. But if I was to crumple it up like this, lots of wrinkles, well, now it will fit. So this is the same reason that we have wrinkles on our brain, so that all that surface area can fit inside of our skulls. Okay. It's also important to note that we have all of those wrinkles by the time we reach full gestation in utero. So by the time we're 40 weeks, or your mom was 40 weeks pregnant with you, you had all those brain wrinkles. Now, you do need to know the 4 lobes of the cerebral cortex. So there are 4 lobes: the frontal lobe, which is in the front, the parietal lobe, the occipital lobe, and the temporal lobes. You have actually 2 of each of them, because remember, our cerebral cortex is divided in half. Okay, so the left hemisphere and the right hemisphere. These are symmetrical on either side. Okay, each of those lobes has a different primary cortex. So in the frontal lobe is the primary motor cortex. Okay, so the orange band on that brain image is the primary motor cortex. The motor cortex is responsible for sending out motor signals to different spots of our body to move. So you can see kind of strange looking how different parts of our brain are associated with specific areas of our body. Okay, the motor cortex is right next to the somatosensory cortex. The somatosensory cortex is this blue line on the parietal lobe, okay, but they back right up to each other. And you can also see how the somatosensory cortex has a similar mapping of the human body as does the motor cortex. It would be important for those things to be near each other. So information that you're receiving about something close to or touching your face, it needs to be near the area of your brain where it's going to send a signal that you either need to move away or move towards whatever that thing is. Okay? So, again, here's the primary visual cortex. It's red in this image. The somatosensory cortex is blue, and those are in the frontal lobe and the parietal lobe, respectively. The primary visual cortex is in the occipital lobes. All the way in the back of the brain is where you process visual information. And then the primary auditory cortex is this dark green area, and that's in the temporal lobes right next to your ears, so it's easy to remember. Okay, and that's where you're processing auditory information. These purple and light green areas are language processing centers. These are lateralized, so that means that these only exist on the left hemisphere, not the right hemisphere. Broca's area is an area for language production. Okay, so language production means writing language, speaking. Okay, if it's Broca, that's how you remember. If it's Broca, you can't talka. Okay, you cannot produce language. Wernicke's area, back here in the light green, is for language comprehension. Okay, so understanding language. If you want to, you can look up Broca's aphasia or Wernicke's aphasia. You can see some videos of individuals who've had damage in those areas and what that looks like, but you don't have to. So about the other 70% of the cortex is an association cortex. So that means it's doing a whole bunch of stuff. We do not have everything mapped out in the brain, so it's connecting everything. Lots of memories get farmed out to the cortex eventually. We'll talk about that too. So higher level processing, integration of information. We do not need a full or complete brain in order to function effectively. So despite the fact that we use 100% of our brain, we don't need all of it to function effectively. In fact, there are multiple case studies that exist that show that humans can live with half a brain, or they have demonstrated that somebody was actually born without the cerebellum, which is this small brain back here at the base of the skull. Okay, so your brain is very what we call plastic. It has plasticity, neuroplasticity, which means it's able to organize itself, reorganize itself, and change effectively. It's especially true that it's able to change effectively when you're a young child. Okay, that's when your brain is most plastic. So the left and right hemispheres, we have two hemispheres of our brain. In individuals who have a certain type of seizure disorder, they will sometimes cut the corpus callosum, which is this connector between the two hemispheres. When that happens, we call those individuals split brain patients. So they actually have two halves of their brain operating independently. They usually are able to operate pretty normally. There are just some things that are a little different. So when you do this, you can see that there are some lateralized tasks. It's also important to recognize that our brain, our left hemisphere, processes information from our right side, and our right hemisphere processes information from our left side. So that can change what you perceive if you are a split brain patient. For the rest of us, I'm sorry what the BuzzFeed quiz told you. You are not left or right brained. That is complete nonsense. There's no evidence to support that you have one side dominant. Very much we integrate across hemispheres, so that doesn't have any evidence. So what we know, even though you are not either left or right brained, we do know that there is lateralization, which means some tasks occur in the left hemisphere versus the right hemisphere. So in the left hemisphere, we have language processing, logic, and analytical skills. On the right hemisphere, we have spatial perception, drawing, and facial recognition. Okay, we are whole-brained. Unless you've had your corpus callosum split, then you can be either right or left brain. Neuroplasticity, like I said, we can regrow brain cells, and adults also grow new brain cells, though at a much slower rate than children. Okay, so 64% of people in class in the spring previously thought we can't regrow brain cells, so we can. Adults do not lose 100,000 neurons each day. Half the class last semester thought that, but it's actually probably about 1/10 of that. So we do lose brain cells every day, but it's not 100,000. Okay, so neuroplasticity refers to the ability of the brain to adopt new functions, reorganize itself, and make new connections based on experiences. Neurogenesis is the development of new neurons. Okay, again, neurogenesis happens. It happens a lot in childhood, and then it continues in adulthood, just at a much slower rate. Okay, that's not true. Excellent. And that is that. I hope you do well on the exam, and I'll see you next week.